Good day. I am Aaron Chan. On behalf of my co-authors, I will be presenting to you our study about investigating the decoupling progress and drivers of resource consumption in Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Globally, there is an increase in extraction of materials, which has brought several environmental problems. As the economies are market-oriented, the production also increases with the population and improvement of economic conditions. Knowing that there is an uneven distribution and scarce resources of the environment, it calls for the need of sustainable consumption and production. A method formulated to manage policies with regards to sustainable resource utilization is to understand the socio-economic metabolism of a country. Among these socio-economic metabolism analysis methods, the economic-wide material flow accounting, or the EWMFA, has become a significant tool with its ability to investigate the biophysical basis of an economy. This allows policymakers to examine significant indicators with economic and environmental interactions. Currently, most of the studies in academia focus on the growing giants. Less attention is given to the developing countries. However, developing countries may also hold considerable impact on environmental emissions. Hence, it is worthwhile to examine the consumption patterns of the emerging economies. This study focuses on investigating the ASEAN countries that are grouped in the same cluster according to the GDP. As there are only limited studies for Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, this study aims to fill in the gap by looking into the decoupling progress and the drivers of resource consumption of the mentioned countries. While at it, this study also illustrates the comparison of the country performances. The EWMFA is the main tool that will be used for this study. This study utilizes the methodological guide of UNEP for compilation of material flow accounts. The data on resource flows were taken from CSIRO database. These resource flows are domestic extraction, imports, exports, and raw material equivalents. For this study, only the four main categories were used. These are biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metallic minerals. As for the domestic process outputs, or the DPO, the four main categories, which are emissions to air, dissipative use of products, waste disposal, and emissions to water, are also considered. The data on these outputs are sourced from different databases, action plans, policy reports, regional reports, and journal articles. As there were data gaps for some TPO categories, statistical straight line was used to fill the gaps using population as explanatory variable. After collecting the necessary material flow data, the MFA indicators were calculated. These are the domestic material consumption per gross domestic product, or DMC per GDP ratio, material footprint per capita, or MF per capita, domestic material input, or DMI, and the impact, population, affluence, and technology, or the IPAT identity. Using these MFA indicators, the results were analyzed, giving the implications on the material use and efficiency of each country. First, we looked into the intensity of material used for each country. This is explained by the DMC per GDP ratio. It also implies the efficiency of a country in utilizing its resource to increase per unit of its economic value. The figure presented here shows the DMC per GDP ratio trend of the three countries. Both Cambodia and Myanmar have their DMC per GDP ratio declining over the past decades. This signifies the increase in efficiency of material usage. The reduction of DMC per GDP ratio can be attributed to the increase of infrastructure development, as both countries imported significant value of non-metallic minerals to complete their backlog projects. Due to this, it paved way for the increase in efficiency of production activities. Contrary to both Cambodia and Myanmar, Laos exhibited a growth in material intensity, which can be attributed to the major economic reforms and increased production for exportation. Nonetheless, Laos has still graduated from being the least developed country. Comparing the three countries in the cluster, Myanmar has exhibited the most improvement over the years. We also investigated the MF per capita of each country. It provides supplementary information on the final resource demand of the country per capita. The figure presented here illustrates the trend of MF per capita of the three countries. It can be observed that there is an evident increase of MF per capita for both Cambodia and Laos. Meanwhile, the MF per capita of Myanmar is increased. Comparing the three countries, it is clear that Laos is the least efficient as it needs the highest number of materials to satisfy the final demands of the population. This result further complements the discussion earlier on DMC per GDP ratio. On the other hand, Myanmar was able to sustain its material footprint while increasing its economic value. This means that Myanmar has been performing well while improving its situation over the past decades. We also explored the decoupling and economic growth of each country. Essentially, we are determined to look at the performance of the countries through their ability to reduce environmental pressures while generating economic growth. The figure presented here shows the economic and environmental trend of the countries using 1970 as the base index year. Both Cambodia and Myanmar demonstrate higher growth of GDP as compared to other environmental indicators. This means that both countries have achieved relative resource and impact decoupling. On the other hand, the growth of GDP failed to surpass the growth of carbon emission in Laos. This indicates that Laos failed to achieve impact decoupling. Specifically, in terms of carbon emission. While it may seem unusual to have the carbon emissions surpass the GDP, yet the DPO is much lower than the GDP, it is primarily because carbon emission is not the major contributor of emissions in the earlier years. In fact, methane was the major source of emission in Laos in the early 1970s. Further investigation shows that air emission contributes the highest proportion to the DPO of all countries. Carbon emissions contributed more for Cambodia, while methane and nitrogen oxides contributed more for Laos and Myanmar. The high emissions of methane and nitrogen oxides of Laos can be attributed to its mining and garment production activities. Meanwhile, the agricultural activities of Myanmar contributed to the high methane and nitrogen oxide emissions. From the investigations, Myanmar can adopt the method of Cambodia in shifting to agricultural machineries for production, which will significantly reduce the dissipative use of products and respective air emissions. Lastly, we examined the drivers of material consumption for each country. The figures presented in the slide shows the percent changes of each factor formulating the IPAT identity. Essentially, we are examining three major factors: population, affluence, and technology. These influence the impact or the material consumption of the countries. The results indicate that only Myanmar has exhibited positive change for the DMC on the first period, while both Cambodia and Laos illustrated negative change in the DMC. This is in accordance with the MF per capita results, illustrating less material needed for satisfaction of final demand of Cambodia and Laos on the first time period. For the succeeding periods, all DMC of all countries have increased. It can be deduced that the affluence is the most significant driver of material consumption in all countries. Indeed, there was a significant change in economies of all the countries. For instance, Both Cambodia and Laos shifted to market-oriented economies, while Myanmar engaged themselves with other countries in economic cooperation. Further results illustrate that both Cambodia and Laos lost their material efficiency for the third time period, as there is a significant growth of material consumption. Nevertheless, the countries were able to enhance their efficiency and exhibit exceptional performance in the recent years. To conclude, this study employed an approach which utilized the material flow accounts to investigate the three ASEAN countries in decoupling and economic growth from the environmental pressures. This study filled the gap by providing material intensity analysis, domestic consumption driver analysis, and comparison of the countries in the same ASEAN cluster. The results indicate that all countries have succeeded in improving their economic value while minimizing their material consumption. However, Laos still must perform better to have a declining DMC per GDP trend. Additionally, the MF per capita increases for all countries. Studies can also be done to investigate ways to reduce material use while satisfying the final demands of a country. As a recommendation, more emphasis should be placed on the reduction of emissions, as current policies on air emissions, municipal waste, and waste disposal are not enough. Policies should also be made for the dissipative use of products. The shift to more sustainable energy sources and shift to machinery use for agriculture are also recommended. Additionally, stricter policy compliance can be implemented. This is especially true for the air emissions for Laos. With that, it sums up all of the key points of our study. Thank you for listening.